January 7th, 1945. Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, Versailles. Eisenhower's office is colder than the winter outside. He sits alone at his desk, reading a transcript that arrived an hour ago from Belgium. The words on the page should be routine, a field marshal briefing reporters. But his hands are not steady. They grip the paper harder than necessary. 3 years of patience. 3 years of coalition warfare where every decision carries the weight of 2 nations, 2 armies, 2 very different ideas about how to win. And now this. The pen on his desk remains untouched. The draft cable to General George Marshall in Washington remains unwritten. But the decision is already forming, cold and final as the snow falling outside the window. Something is about to break. Not on the battlefield. Here. 7 hours earlier, Belgium. Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery stands before assembled correspondents at Zonhoven, wearing a maroon beret and parachute harness. His chief of intelligence, Brigadier Williams, had begged him not to hold this conference. Alan Moorhead, the correspondent, had pleaded with Montgomery's chief of staff, Major General Freddie de Guingand, to stop him. He'll make some bloody awful mistake, Moorhead warned. De Guingand had tried. Montgomery refused to listen. Now the cameras flash. The field marshal speaks for an hour without notes, explaining how the Battle of the Bulge unfolded. He praises the American soldier, calls Eisenhower the captain of the team. His intentions seem honorable, but the words land differently than he intends. The phrasing creates an impression, a narrative where the Americans stumbled until he, Montgomery, stepped in to save the day. He compares the German retreat to his victory over Rommel at El Alamein in 1942. The British press is already writing the headlines. Montgomery foresaw attack, acted on own to save day. 300 miles south, the transcript reaches Eisenhower's desk. December 1941 to January 1945. The Anglo-American alliance was never a partnership of equals, only a marriage of necessity. On one side, Dwight Eisenhower, consensus builder, political general whose genius lay not in battlefield tactics, but in keeping fractious allies pointed toward Germany rather than each other's throats. He understood that coalition warfare was as much diplomacy as it was strategy. On the other, Bernard Montgomery, victor of El Alamein, methodical, brilliant in set-piece battles, and suffering from a narcissism so profound it blinded him to every political reality around him. By early 1945, the balance had shifted. Britain provided experience and tradition. America provided 80% of the men, 90% of the equipment, nearly all the fuel. The student had become the master. Montgomery never accepted this. He lobbied constantly for supreme command of all ground forces, effectively demanding Eisenhower demote himself. Washington despised him. Churchill repeatedly intervened to save his most famous general from his own ambition. But Eisenhower had always protected him, always smoothed over the insults, always made the coalition work. Until the snow fell in the Ardennes, and everything Montgomery believed about his own indispensability collided with a single, terrible miscalculation. December 16th, 1944. 05:30 hours. 24 German divisions, 10 of them armored, smash into the Ardennes forest. The offensive splits General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group. His 1st and 9th Armies to the north lose contact with his headquarters to the south. Communications collapse. The bulge in Allied lines grows deeper, threatening to reach the Meuse River. Eisenhower makes the hardest decision of the campaign. The 1st and 9th Armies, 200,000 American troops, must be temporarily transferred to Montgomery's command. It is pure military logic, unity of command during crisis. For Bradley, it feels like humiliation. For Lieutenant General George Patton, it borders on treason. Both men obey, expecting Montgomery to act as temporary steward, respecting American command structure. Instead, Montgomery arrives at 1st Army headquarters like a feudal lord inspecting a failed vassal. He rejects defensive plans, reorganizes lines, stops counterattacks, lectures exhausted American generals on basic tactics. "I shall tidy up this mess," he reportedly says. The phrase burns into American memory. Montgomery successfully stabilizes the northern shoulder. This is historical fact. But his manner destroys every remaining thread of goodwill. American officers begin openly discussing whether they'd rather fight Germans or British. Montgomery remains oblivious. He mistakes their silence for agreement, their discipline for submission. He believes he has proven himself indispensable. January 7th, 1945, afternoon. Eisenhower reads Montgomery's press conference transcript a second time, then a third. The field marshal barely mentioned the heroic defense of Bastogne by the 101st Airborne Division. 19,000 Americans died in the Ardennes. Montgomery described it as one of the most interesting and tricky battles I have ever handled. Trivializing, patronizing, taking credit for American blood. The telephone calls begin within the hour. Bradley warns he will resign rather than serve under Montgomery again. "I cannot take this," he tells Eisenhower. Patton demands to be unleashed. The entire U.S. command structure threatens to fracture. Eisenhower has spent 3 years mediating, 3 years compromising, 3 years placing coalition unity above personal pride. But there are lines even a coalition general cannot cross. Montgomery has publicly humiliated the army Eisenhower commands. He has threatened the political stability that keeps American and British forces fighting together instead of apart. Eisenhower pulls out paper. The pen finally moves. Late December 1944. The crisis before the crisis. Montgomery had been demanding supreme ground command for months. His letters to London criticized American competence. His cables to Eisenhower bordered on insubordination. On December 30th, Eisenhower reached his limit. He drafted a message, not to Montgomery, but to the combined chiefs of staff through General Marshall. The wording was cold, precise, and devastating. He outlined an unbridgeable gulf between Supreme Headquarters and 21st Army Group. He stated the command structure had become unworkable. He presented the chiefs with a choice they could not avoid. Montgomery or himself, one of them had to go. Major General Freddie de Guingand arrived at Eisenhower's headquarters that day and saw the draft. His face went white. He understood immediately what Montgomery did not. Eisenhower was not bluffing. The combined chiefs would choose the supreme commander over a difficult field marshal. De Guingand begged Eisenhower for 48 hours. Eisenhower agreed. The cable remained unsent. De Guingand drove through a blizzard to Montgomery's headquarters. When he arrived, he found the field marshal in excellent spirits, completely unaware of the abyss opening beneath him. January 7th, 1945, evening. The press conference has made the December crisis look like rehearsal. Eisenhower drafts a new message to Marshall. This one is simpler, more final. The choice he presents is identical. It's him or Montgomery. He shows the draft to de Guingand, who has rushed back to Versailles. De Guingand reads the words and realizes Montgomery has finally crossed the line from which there is no return. No apology will fix this. No clarification will undo the damage. The American command is in open revolt, and Eisenhower must choose between his own army and his British ally. The document is ready to send. All it needs is Eisenhower's signature, and the British Empire's most famous general will be relieved of command. Harold Alexander, diplomatic but strategically limited, has already been suggested as replacement. Eisenhower sets down his pen. "Show this to Montgomery," he tells de Guingand. "Let him understand exactly where he stands." The ultimatum is unspoken but absolute. Shut up or get out. De Guingand reaches Montgomery's headquarters near midnight. The field marshal is still cheerful, still convinced his press conference went well, still certain he is untouchable. De Guingand does not waste time. He describes the cable Eisenhower has prepared. He describes the American fury. He explains that Churchill himself cannot save Montgomery this time. "Ike is going to fire you," de Guingand says, "and he has full support from Washington and London." For a moment, Montgomery laughs. Impossible. They need him. Ike would never dare. Then de Guingand describes Eisenhower's face, the cold precision of the language, the fact that Harold Alexander has been mentioned as replacement. Reality hits Montgomery like physical impact. The smile vanishes. He slumps into his chair, suddenly looking older than his 57 years. For the first time in the war, the great field marshal understands he has miscalculated everything. He is not dealing with a weak politician. He is facing the most powerful military commander in the Western world. And he has pushed exactly one step too far. The silence in the tactical trailer is absolute. The indispensable man realizes he is about to be discarded. January 8th, 1945. Morning. A letter arrives on Eisenhower's desk, written in Montgomery's own hand. "Dear Ike, I am distressed that my note may have upset you." The tone is unrecognizable. No demands, no lectures, no strategic advice, only abject apology. "Whatever your decision may be, you can rely upon me 100% to make it work." The signature reads, "Your very devoted subordinate, Monty." It is the most humiliating document Montgomery has ever signed. A complete, unconditional surrender from a man who has never surrendered to anyone. Eisenhower reads it without expression. He does not gloat. He does not celebrate. He simply nods, takes the firing order from his desk, and places it in a file marked secret. He sends a reply accepting the apology. But the tone is cool, professional, distant. The crisis is over. The alliance is saved. The friendship is dead. January 1945 through May 1945. Montgomery remains in command. But everything has changed. Eisenhower never trusts him again. Their relationship becomes purely functional. When operations resume, Eisenhower leans heavily on Bradley, giving American forces the lead in the final drive into Germany. When the Rhine crossings come, Montgomery stages an elaborate operation in the north. But Eisenhower ensures American forces cross first, taking the glory Montgomery assumed would be his. The shut-up or get-out moment marks more than a personal break. It cements American dominance in the post-war order. The baton passes definitively from British Empire to American superpower. Churchill understands this. He privately tells his staff Montgomery nearly wrecked everything. Montgomery later admits in his memoirs, So great was the feeling against me on the part of the American generals that whatever I said was bound to be wrong. I should therefore have said nothing. Eisenhower's assessment is colder. I doubt if Montgomery ever came to realize how resentful some American commanders were. They believed he had belittled them, and they were not slow to voice reciprocal scorn and contempt. On May 4th, 1945, Montgomery accepts the German surrender in Northern Europe. On May 8th, final victory. In photographs, Eisenhower and Montgomery stand side by side on Victory Day. The cameras capture Allied unity. Behind the images, the isolation is complete. Montgomery keeps his rank, keeps his honors. Later becomes Viscount Montgomery of Alamein. But to the Allied High Command, he is a liability that has been neutralized. He has won his battles but lost the respect of the men who mattered. He remains a hero to the British public. In the corridors of power, he is the general who forgot that brilliance without judgment is merely expensive talent. Years later, as NATO deputy commander under Eisenhower again, Montgomery tries to rebuild the relationship. It never fully recovers. The press conference of January 7, 1945, cost him more than he could have imagined. Not his career, but his voice. He kept his stars. He lost his influence. History remembers the Battle of the Bulge for tanks and frozen foxholes. But the most decisive battle was fought in a warm office with a pen and paper. Eisenhower's victory over Montgomery was not tactical. It was a victory of character over ego, of coalition management over individual brilliance, of understanding that in global war, no one general, no matter how skilled, is bigger than the mission. Montgomery thought he was indispensable. Eisenhower proved that every soldier, even field marshals, ultimately answered to someone. And when forced to choose between protecting his ally and protecting his army, Eisenhower chose his army. The ultimatum was never actually sent. De Guingam's midnight intervention saved Montgomery from official dismissal. But the message was delivered anyway, in the coldest possible terms. Shut up, or get out. Montgomery chose to shut up. The alternative was unthinkable. That day, January 7th, 1945, the alliance was saved not by a cannon, but by an ultimatum. And the great field marshal learned that respect, once lost, can never be fully regained. He could move divisions. He could plan operations. But he had forgotten the fundamental rule. In coalition warfare, dignity matters as much as divisions. The pen proved mightier than the sword, and Eisenhower's restraint proved deadlier than any direct confrontation. The snow eventually melted in the Ardennes. The frost between Eisenhower and Montgomery never did.